It is Friday, February 10th. Let's talk PlayStation. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We've got plenty of PlayStation news from this past week. So first up, as always, our PS Plus reminder. The February PS Plus Essential lineup is now live on PSN, so go check those games out, go download them, add them to your library. For our first story, very quickly, The Last of Us Part 1 on PC has been delayed very slightly from March 3rd to March 28th, so not a massive delay, just needs a little more time in the oven to work out some bugs and kinks. So if you are on the lookout for that particular version of that game, just bear in mind you're going to have to wait a little bit longer, but not a massive delay. Moving on to some unsurprising news, there's only a few things in the world of PlayStation that we can look at every time and feel confident in saying that yep, that's probably going to happen. And one of those things would be San Diego studio making an MLB game every year, which, by the way, they confirmed recently, MLB 23. We really don't cover those games typically. But also Polyphony Digital working on a Gran Turismo game. So what happened recently was, in a conversation with GameWatch, the series creator Kazunori Yamauchi was asked about the series, the future of the series, and if there's anything else they'd like to achieve, and Yamauchi responded by saying that there is a theme they'd like to get to, and that they're working on the next title but can't talk about it yet. Now, unless there is some kind of translation issue, which it seems very cut and dry there, and there's not really many, mental gymnastics we have to pull here to come to the conclusion that they're probably, working on another Gran Turismo game. S7 just launched, and it's probably got a content roadmap of a few years, right? So, but we should be expecting another entry at some point. In the same interview, we did also learn that Gran Turismo 7, from the very onset, was made with PlayStation VR2 in mind, which sort of goes to show why we're getting, full VR2 functionality versus Gran Turismo Sport, where, many aspects of the first PSVR in totality were, very much felt like it was tacked onto the PS4 experience. Despite the fact that actually development of PSVR goes beyond, PS4 launching, but I think you understand my point. But that was still, good to hear. Now let's move on to this new job listing at PlayStation, where, normally if we're bringing up a job listing, it's because there's something in there that maybe shouldn't have. And that is what's going on here. So this position is for a senior dialogue designer in London, and it had an interesting list of studios under the You Are section where it says, and I quote here, "You are interested in collaborating with sound design and music to deliver outstanding soundscapes for major AAA projects alongside our partners at studios such as Naughty Dog, Santa Monica Studio, Guerrilla Games, Firesprite, Ballistic Moon, London Studios, Housemarque, Media Molecule, Insomniac Games, Sucker Punch Productions, and more." Now, of course, the standout there is Ballistic Moon, and we had already caught wind of this project prior from two separate occasions, one being the XDev leak, where they were listed on there plainly as a PS5 PC title, codenamed Project Bates, a horror game, also utilizing Decima, and we had also seen it from, it was one or two voice actors working on the game, and they had listed Project Bates in collaboration with PlayStation, so we had those two things happen. And of course, Ballistic is a real studio. It's something where they're a fairly new team. They were formed from former Supermassive staff, so that also tracks with them working on a brand new horror title. So clearly they're working on a new PS Studios title, and we should be seeing this at some point once they're ready to talk about it. But this would be something where we can now make a direct connection that is, officially from Sony. So we have some direct acknowledgement of the studio's partnership with PlayStation. But it is also worth noting that the way they're listed on this job listing might infer that they are, maybe getting a little bit too cozy with Sony. So they're in, that lineup there was a bunch of first-party teams, and so some might infer that perhaps Sony has acquired them, and this is a slip-up like we saw with Blue Point Games. Now, that's not impossible. In fact, I would say that's a very plausible conclusion to draw. It is worth mentioning that on the job listing it specifically calls out first and second-party studios, so remember, in the context of PlayStation Studios, that's always going to include first-party and second-party projects. Although it is, a little bit weird to see just Ballistic Moon on there, but it might be just, one given example. Either way, I wouldn't jump to conclusions just yet, although I would say that Ballistic really fits the new Sony criteria nowadays, which, we've talked about this before, but their merger and acquisition strategy has always been long-standing partners that, Sony trusts and feels comfortable with and makes sense, and they've proven themselves over multiple years and projects. Now they've already picked up the most obvious studios in that situation. Now what they've done is pivot towards utilizing or rather trying to target studios that I consider them, and this is how Sony's definitely doing it, but they're a little bit on the cheaper side because they're not nearly as established. But they're, Sony always looks at talent, not necessarily IP, so they're going for, newer studios like Firesprite, which they have worked with before as well, but Haven Studios, obviously Bungie was kind of an outlier, but that's still something where they want the talent for their own live service projects, but that's how Sony's been primarily doing it now, and so Ballistic would absolutely fit that new criteria. So if they did pick up Ballistic, that just means that they're really enjoying the progress that they're making so far, and they feel they want to, get in while the iron's hot. So, but for now, we'll have to let that speculation just be speculation and just take this for what it is. Sony finally acknowledging that they do have a partnership with this studio. Moving on to our next story, it looks like we might finally have a PlayStation live stream coming fairly soon. 2 live streams, one a state of play, and then finally a proper PlayStation showcase. This is coming from Giant Bomb's Jeff Grubb. Recently during a Game Us Decides podcast, he had mentioned very briefly that in the coming weeks we should be expecting a state of play that might not be very exciting, so essentially something that's more run-of-the-mill. I presume that's just going to be some third-party announcements, maybe some indie stuff in there, but that should be around, before March essentially, or before the end of March is how he was phrasing it. And then as for a PlayStation showcase, something where that might be closer to around the E3 timeframe before June, but it would come a bit after the state of play. And that's all he said, didn't really elaborate further, but this more or less goes into what I was expecting when I discussed this during the PlayStation predictions video for the beginning of this year, right? So I feel like they're going to be ready to talk about some things around that E3 timeframe, so not something where they're going to be necessarily a part of E3, obviously, but they might do some sort of very subtle branding with the Summer Game Fest. I don't really know, but it should be around that time frame where Sony returns to the standard 45-minute or longer format of a live stream that has a lot of announcements. This is a very important year for Sony. We need to know what a lot of these 2023 and also 2024 games are going to be, but they are also in a place where they're not announcing things years in advance nowadays. So they're kind of in this weird spot where we go a long time without hearing anything like we have for the past year and a half now, right? So, but they are due to show a lot of new things. We need a new Spider-Man trailer, of course, and that would be the place to do it. And so, and having the state of play prior to maybe get some smaller things out of the way, that also just makes a lot of sense to me. So for now, we'll just kind of wait and see what happens, but that does sound about right. All right, moving on to some PSVR2 news. So right off the top, we can say Horizon Call of the Mountain has officially gone gold. That's good. So if there were any doubts this game was not going to be ready for day one, it will be. That's good. Probably more noteworthy is that the press has PSVR2 units in hand, so we should find out fairly soon when the embargo is going to lift, but I would have to guess that it's probably going to be fairly soon. This is, basically a brand new platform launch, so I would assume it's maybe a tiered embargo, and we should be able to hear, certain impressions in the coming days, and then over time we'll get more and more coverage as more and more games are reviewed and talked about, but should be getting a lot of PSVR2 coverage very soon, considering the headset is right around the corner. And because it's right around the corner, we also have the standard typical PlayStation blog FAQ. It's pretty thorough, long. If you had any questions about PSVR2, it's probably answered on there. Boilerplate stuff. There's nothing that is necessarily new info on there except for a few things. The one thing that's not on there is we have no idea if PSVR2 can play 3D Blu-rays. The old PSVR that could do it over time. It got a firmware update to allow that. I'm not even sure if they'll prioritize adding that this time around. They didn't even acknowledge it here or say no, right? Or, there's nothing there on the blog for that. So just keep that in mind. I tried it one time on the first headset. It actually works reasonably well, but 3D is not really much of a thing nowadays, so it wouldn't surprise me if they just aren't going to do it. But That was not on the FAQ. What was, in terms of, I guess, new stuff, is the cinematic mode, which we knew was going to be there, but now we know for sure it's 1920 by 1080 with HDR and up to 120 hertz. So pretty interesting. In theory, that means it doesn't matter what TV you have. If you want to play a game at the 120 hertz mode in the cinematic mode, which, you know, that's something where you can play any standard 2D PS5 game, but it would be in more or less a replicated sort of display, so it almost feels like you're in a giant theater. Not virtually per se, it's all going to be a black border, but it, you know, in terms of perception, it'll look like a giant screen in front of you. So you'll be able to play, you know, high frame rate mode games via PSVR2 if you wanted to. That would be pretty cool to try. But we also heard that PSVR2 Sense controllers will not be sold separately for now. So if you're getting PSVR2, you might want to be very careful with those Sense controllers, because if they break, I'm not sure what you would do. Well, I mean, if you damage it, then that's something where you can't actively buy a new one, right? I mean, if it breaks in terms of it being faulty, of course it's warranted, but if you physically damage it, I'm not sure what you would do right now, but I would hope that they'll probably get a listing up on PlayStation Direct fairly soon for replacements. Now, we did have something pretty interesting come up when it comes to PSVR2's performance and how it benchmarks compared to PCVR, which would be the most comparable way to, I guess, explain where PSVR2 sits, and we had a developer anecdote here that I thought was worth sharing. So this is coming from over on Twitter at Flat2VR. They screen capped this conversation on Discord from a developer working on Pavlov, and they gave a pretty straightforward answer on PSVR2's performance. When someone asked about the haptic feedback, they responded saying that the headset is the pinnacle of VR, especially for shooters, and they also claimed it's around 10% above PCVR in terms of performance, explaining how the rendering is more efficient on console. When someone wanted clarification on what that means, wondering what GPU they were comparing it to, they responded with the 3090 Ti, which I'm sure some might look at that and think that's ridiculous. No way. How is that possible? That's ridiculous. But, well, there's a few things going on here. That doesn't sound nearly as impossible as one would think. Just, you know, before even considering VR, this is something people always undermine, which is consoles do have a lot of efficiencies that PC just simply does not have. They're purpose-built boxes. You can extract a lot out of a console. They're meant to just strictly play video games. There's a pipeline, a software development kit that is tailor-made to extracting the most you possibly can out of these boxes. And that's why historically there's just been so many games and studios that can pull off some amazing things on a given box, right? So there's always that at play. But to really sort of make up the considerable delta here, that the ground on, say, a 3090 Ti and even exceeding it, we're talking about the PC space. So again, what is a purpose-built box that is, you know, has a streamlined SDK for PSVR2 software? That's simply not the case for PCVR. You know, you actually need to throw a pretty hefty machine at PCVR to see, you know, similar performance to PSVR2. So it just doesn't sound nearly as crazy as one would think. That, you know, PSVR2 also has these other things like the foveated rendering and the eye tracking. You know, that alone has a marginal difference when it comes to developers squeezing a bit of detail out of, you know, strictly what you're looking at, right? And your periphery has a less detailed image of the entire scene. There's just a few things in the SDK that is, I think, really going a long way for making this not sound as ridiculous as one would think. But you also have to remember PS5 is still no slouch here. It's a $500 console, or really $400 for that base machine. But, you know, it's when we're talking about price to performance, or the price versus performance ratio, you get a lot out of a console always, and PS5 and Series X are in a really good spot nowadays. So with PS5 and bringing in PSVR2, you're, you know, all in, you're looking at $1,000 setup. It's still not cheap, but for $1,000, I think it goes a long way on getting a premium VR experience. So I think it's going to bode well for those comparisons that we're inevitably going to see once the headset launches. Now, moving on to The Last of Us HBO, it's more or less the same story from the past 3 weeks so far, which is that the viewership numbers keep climbing. So as reported by Variety, which again, they're getting telemetry from Warner Brothers Discovery directly, but they're reporting that episode 4 of The Last of Us HBO debuted at 7.5 million viewers, representing a 17% improvement from episode 3, which is pretty nuts. So word of mouth is really helping the show big time, acquiring new viewers, and the ones that tuned in from episode 1 are clearly still motivated and invested in the story being told so far, so they're sticking around, which is good, of course. But episode 5 airs tonight, so just keep that in mind. They're trying to avoid the time slot next to the Super Bowl, which, I mean, smart play there, but just keep in mind the show is actually airing tonight. And well, in terms of, well, while we're talking about the Super Bowl real quick, we can also say that Sony's going to probably have a PlayStation 5 ad at the Super Bowl. I've seen some theorize that there's the implication that Sony's going to announce God of War Ragnarok DLC at the Super Bowl because they're talking about Fimbulwinter coming to the Sunday or something. I think they're just kind of messing around and teasing. I mean, they have a brand new Live from PS5 marketing campaign. I don't think they're going to announce a new thing outside of just letting a lot of people know in probably a 30-second time slot that, hey, PS5 is now in stock. Now, in terms of other PlayStation Productions projects, the God of War TV show with Amazon Prime, we've got some news here, nothing crazy, but the president of Sony Pictures Television Studios, Catherine Pope, was speaking with Deadline on a number of industry-related topics, and also adapting PlayStation IP was something that she was asked about. So she gave this quote where she says, "There's a lot of really important IP here. We're working on God of War, the PlayStation title, which is still in the early stages. I know the game pretty well, and I'm so impressed with what they're already doing in terms of building out that world and expanding, keeping all the values of the game, but also expanding it so that if you don't know the game, it's still going to be a really satisfying show on its own." You know, it's so funny how we just got a new benchmark for how you adapt games into TV, but despite that, there's still a lot of doubt on this project because it's Amazon Prime, it's what they've said so far about it, and look, of course it's too early, you can't draw conclusions, but, you know, I see it because, let's face it, it's just, there's kind of no good way to approach it based on how they've described it so far, which they're starting off with Norse. You know, I've said before, like, I just want a movie. Give me a movie, make it 2 hours long, throw a huge budget, do a lot of crazy CGI, maybe some practical effects where it makes sense, but, you know, that would, I think that would be more serviceable to what God of War is, or rather to the Greek timeline, and then maybe do a TV show, because the problem is it's a lose-lose scenario. So I get that people want them to start with the Greek timeline, because that's where you should see Kratos' true origin story, and that, you know, adds more weight to the Norse timeline. Makes sense, but the problem is you can't do that for a TV show when Kratos has no emotional story to really tell outside of that initial, you know, intro and backstory, right? After that, it's a bunch of ruthless killings, and, you know, Kratos is a one-track, one-mind character with a vocabulary of 5 words, and 3 of them are Gaia, Zeus, and kill, right? Like, and if you do more than that, then that's not Kratos, and it feels, you know, inauthentic. So you can't do a Greek timeline for the TV show, but if you jump right into Norse, where that is an emotional story and there's character development there, but then you lose the backstory, right? So that's why I feel it's really tough going into this, and yeah, Amazon Prime isn't really doing them any favors for the sort of image that comes with this show, but the skepticism is certainly there for me, there's no doubt about it. Moving on to our big story from this past week, it's a major update in the Microsoft acquisition of Activision Blizzard and King Digital Entertainment. We, of course, follow this news story closely because it has major implications for the PlayStation business and the wide-reaching games business as a whole. So there's a lot to go over, so bear with me, but we do have those updates from the EU and the UK CMA, so starting off, as reported by Politico, the European Union has issued a formal antitrust warning to Microsoft over the ABK deal. Under the possibility of Microsoft having an incentive to block access to Call of Duty, the union says, and I quote, Such foreclosure strategies could reduce competition in the markets for the distribution of console and PC video games, leading to higher prices, lower quality, and less innovation for console game distributors, which may in turn be passed on to consumers. In response, Microsoft says they remain committed to finding a path forward for the deal. Now, the CMA has released their provisional findings report, which, big surprise, they are still opposed to the deal. Now, this is a 277-page document. There's no way we're going to be able to cover or talk about things in here, but at least most of it is really things we've talked about before in their initial report that they put out, right? The response reports that came out. We, did a deep dive on a lot of those and went over a lot of the quotes. And so a lot of that is the same stuff in here, right? So remember, this is all kind of evolutionary rather than revolutionary. A lot of it's additive, so there's not really much in there we can cherry pick this time, so we're not really going to bother doing that. And besides, most of it you can't draw big conclusions on because a lot of the juicy stuff is all redacted. And we do have to remember, when it comes to this process, they have internal documents from Microsoft, Sony, other unnamed third parties. They've got a ton of telemetry that we unfortunately are not able to see, which would certainly generate some good talking points, but we just are not able to do that more often than not. But basically, to surmise their findings here, they have two core issues, and that's gaming console gaming and cloud gaming in the UK due to vertical effects resulting from input foreclosure. The CMA has also published their initial suggested remedies. Number 1, divestiture of the business associated with Call of Duty. Number 2, divestiture of the Activision segment. Number 3, divestiture of the Activision and Blizzard segment. Or number 4, a prohibition of the entire merger. As of right now, it's important to understand this. Microsoft nor Activision has discussed remedies with the CMA, and the CMA only investigates remedies more closely after this report. So while Microsoft has informed them of the proposed contractual agreements, this is all still in a preliminary stage, and that means they are still accepting conversations from Microsoft or any relevant parties, and they've got a deadline of February 22nd to, hear more about possible remedies and maybe even behavioral remedies as well, right? That's not totally out of the question. This is not something where the EU or the CMA are flat out saying, nope, you're done, we're not letting this go through. It's that phase of the process where they're formally putting it out there that, hey, we have a problem with this and you're going to have to do something. That was more or less expected the entire way through at this point. I mean, that much was obvious. I think the real big shocker is what comes after this, right? So there is going to be conversations of exploring possible concessions, possible remedies, what Microsoft is going to be willing to do, what the EU and CMA are going to want that will satisfy their requirements to let the deal go through without any sort of major hiccups or any more issues, right, throughout the regulatory process. And once that's done, that's where we'll get the, that's where it might get really exciting, or rather, just there might be some shocking revelations, because right now this was a pretty clear-cut path on them both opposing the deal. And so while it sounds really bad, and certainly it doesn't sound good when you have the CMA making these sort of preliminary suggestions of, oh, and by the way, we have some ideas. Why don't you just sell Call of Duty? Why don't you just sell Activision? That might work for us. You could also just sell Activision and Blizzard. You guys said you only wanted the mobile stuff, right? And that all this other stuff isn't nearly as big of a deal. Like, initially, that doesn't sound very good for Microsoft, and there's no scenario I picture personally where they're going to agree to that. They want the whole pie. There's a reason why they acquired the entire pie to begin with, right? So I don't see them, letting go of an entire segment. They're going to try and get out of this, not get out of the deal, but they're going to try and complete the deal with the least amount of concessions possible. And that would be something like behavioral remedies, which they're already trying to talk about a lot publicly with the whole, contractual obligations, and we want to ship Call of Duty everywhere. No, we're really about having these games on more devices, this, that, and the other. So you can see how they're going to try and play into that. But so far, at least, that's what we have. The deadline is February 22nd, so we might see something shortly after that. But, for the deal being meant to close in June, July, right around there. So, I mean, we're going to start seeing more stuff fairly soon. But we can also, I guess, mention on top of this, so there is more here, but the CMA commissioned a survey from DJS Research, which was looking into the behavior of PlayStation users who have played Call of Duty between July 2021 and June 2022. They emailed 40,000 users and received 1,397 valid responses. So there's a lot of data in here, but here's some of the more relevant ones. So Call of Duty was the top game choice when factored into buying a PlayStation at 73%. Exclusive titles was a close second with 69%. In the hypothetical situation of the current Call of Duty game not being available, 16% said they would still buy a PlayStation and another device, whereas 15% said they would buy another device altogether instead. Of that 31% total, 61% said they would buy an Xbox. In the situation of the next game not being on PlayStation, 41% said they would play older Call of Duty games they already own. 23% said they'd play the most recent one on another device, and 22% said they would stop playing the series altogether. In the event of having to buy Call of Duty elsewhere, 89% said they would still buy non-Call of Duty games on PlayStation. So again, they only surveyed about 1,300 people, or nearly 1,400, which sounds low, but that's about right for these highly targeted surveys where they can send invites out to 40, 50,000 people, and they'll only see about 4 or 5% actually respond, despite there being like a cash prize, which in this case it was £5. But yeah, that sounds about right. They're just going to take this number and extrapolate it to try and get a better idea of the market that they're looking to understand a bit more throughout this process. So, and this could be skewed, right? So, I mean, it's not a lot of people, it's not a ton of data, but just something where they are going to look at this. And I would say, looking at this survey, I mean, if anything, it doesn't really help Sony's case. It just sort of highlights that PlayStation consumers in the UK are willing to continue buying PlayStation hardware and buy non-Call of Duty games on PlayStation, just that they would be faced with the unfortunate reality of, say, having to buy another device, right? So this doesn't really do Sony any favors when it comes to them being such an open opposer to the deals, saying Call of Duty, if we're losing them in some kind of, timeline here down the road, then that's a detriment to our bottom line. And look, that's still true. I mean, it's a big franchise that's not replaceable right now, so they would lose a ton of money. But this survey is not really highlighting how that would how that would be the case. Although I will say this does lean into the UK, or the CMA's job for the UK market. So I know the CMA has gotten a lot of flack lately, and that a lot of it goes to the console, fanboy stuff, right? But looking beyond that, of course, which we are always trying to do here, they're a regulatory body, right? But they're only looking at the UK market, which Xbox has a decent market share in. So PlayStation and Xbox are a lot closer in the UK versus other markets. So granted, like the EU, Sony has been outselling them handedly for 20-something years. So, but that commission's also entirely different. They're going to be approaching it different, and you can make other arguments for how they're maybe being too harsh, this, that, and the other. The CMA is looking very harsh just because they're looking the most harsh because they publish all these documents that we can read, and they're just being so open about it, obviously. But they're concerned with their market. They're not looking at Europe. They're not looking at the US. They're not considering the global factors. They're just considering that, okay, UK customers may have to buy another device to play this game. That works towards Sony's benefit, right? So it's just something to always consider. So again, the CMA has been getting a lot of flack for being misinformed or not understanding the games industry, normally I'm right with you on that angle, but they do have a ton of telemetry, a ton of data, internal documents, and things that we are not seeing that they are able to comb over and help them in this process. So while I would agree that most often, if you're not directly in the games industry, it's going to be hard for you to have an informed take, but I would say they're doing not nearly as bad of a job as some would suggest. Now, having said all that, we do have one more thing here, which is the Activision CEO, Bobby Kotick, doing an interview with Fox Business discussing largely the ABK deal, of course. And so this is something where he brought up a number of things, discussing how the regulators, like we just said, have very little experience looking into the games business, but that right now he calls the games business fragmented with a lot of competition. The dominant players are Japanese and Chinese companies, And he even mentions that Call of Duty is a military simulation experience, which is not a proprietary idea. Basically, this is another case of careful wording and prepared talking points in favor of getting the deal closed. And amazingly, The Last of Us HBO came up again as a way to highlight Sony's dominant position. So clearly Activision thinks this is indeed a good argument to be making, as we saw last week with that far-reaching Twitter thread from Activision's CCO. But he did say Sony is not making any calls or responding to Activision right now, and Kotick highlighted how this is around the time where conversations would be starting to do some kind of partnership. I assume he's referring to the current marketing and content agreement they have with Sony that is supposed to end in 2024. So that is true when you're near the end of that marketing agreement, or you're coming up on 1-2 years out. You're going to start talking again, figuring out the pricing, if you're going to work out something again, and somebody could also come in as a higher bidder, so Microsoft could very well pull it back from Sony and sign up for another multi-year marketing and content agreement. But hearing him say that they're not taking their calls, and this goes a bit further. So speaking with the Financial Times, he also said that Sony is more or less trying to sabotage the deal, and that they're not taking any calls from Activision or Microsoft in this case. So they're not reciprocating, and Sony responded by more or less saying that we are speaking with Microsoft and we're in contact privately. And of course, we're not going to get more details beyond that, but it kind of seeing some more bite going on there, right? Some more drama, which we haven't seen for a bit since when Jim Ryan put it out in the public forum, right? Or rather, Phil Spencer did it, and then Jim Ryan felt the need to respond about the whole 3-year, 10-year thing. But anyway, the point is, it's interesting hearing Kotick say this, though, especially with again, I assume he's talking about the multi-year agreement that they currently have with Sony. So, I mean, just with that alone, what are they supposed to do? With the current context of what is happening, you're trying to sell yourself to a competitor. So, what is Sony supposed to just kind of operate as usual and sign another multi-year agreement? Which, I mean, if anything, that doesn't look good for them, because they already don't want to sign any contractual agreements that sort of give them the green light of saying, yeah, we're okay with the deal. Now, of course, Microsoft would probably honor that agreement going into the acquisition. They've done that so far, and like we said, they do seem completely willing to ship Call of Duty on PlayStation for the foreseeable future, but signing any contract, even one right now where they're not acquired just yet, I mean, they don't want to do that. So I'm not sure what Sony is supposed to do there with conversations. Of course, they're not going to have them, but not having any talks with Activision or Microsoft, I mean, again, it's something where Sony's going to look like the whiner here, or they're the ones throwing a fit. But as we've said before, they're doing exactly what any company in this position would do. So there's really not much more to add beyond that. I think it's almost silly to think that they would, sit back idly and let this happen, right? Or that they would be in complete agreement to go, okay, yeah, pick up a massive publisher and, own one of the most valuable IPs in gaming. Like, they're just not going to do that. So that's all we have for now, but we'll always keep up with this deal as more things come up. Now, with all that said, it is time for Let's Talk Plus, the weekly Let's Talk PlayStation giveaway, where one of you can win a $10 PSN code. I would like to congratulate this viewer right here. I'll be contacting you very soon via email or Twitter, and if you'd like to win a $10 PSN code, it's very easy. You can follow the link down below. Supporting this channel a number of ways can gain you an entry, and I'll announce the winner next week because I'm trying to help pay for your games. Those are all the stories that I wanted to talk about with you all from this past week, and our Tuesday video was another trophy video, so had an itch recently to play some PSP stuff, and no better way to do it than the new PSP titles on PS Plus Premium. There's not many to go around, but some of them recently got patched for trophies, and Pinball Heroes came out with trophies. But played some games there, good fun. We'll always do those occasionally, but as usual, another Tuesday upload. So that's pretty much it. So that concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Benecki. Thank you all so much for talking with me, and I will see you all next Friday.